Hello, I am turning this video in for a school assignment, so this is my disclaimer that it is not monetized. I have to state out loud that it's not monetized for my grading rubric, so now you all will know that it is not monetized. Not that it would have been monetized anyway due to the content. On April 6, 1994, an airplane carrying the Rwandan president and the Burundian president was shot down over the capital city of Kigali in Rwanda. This was the inciting incident for the 1994 Rwandan genocide, where the Hutu ethnic majority took up arms against the Tutsi ethnic minority. Within an hour of the plane crash, war was already beginning. The Presidential Guard, along with Hutu militia groups and the armed forces of Rwanda, started to set up barricades along the roads, blocking exits from major cities and preventing intercity travel and preventing anyone from leaving the country. Shortly after this, they began slaughtering Tutsis. Soon this also extended to moderate-leaning or liberal-leaning Hutus. This tragic event lasted nearly exactly 100 days, with the official dates of the genocide being April 7th to July 15th in the year 1994. Violence spread with shocking speed and brutality. Ordinary citizens were encouraged by Hutu nationalists and their government to take up arms against their own neighbors, and they did so with surprising ease. Over 800,000 people were murdered in this tragic, awful attempt at ethnic cleansing. By the time early July hit and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was a Tutsi-led group, managed to take control of the country again, there was already mass death and a humanitarian crisis the world had not seen before. Hundreds of thousands of Rwandans were dead and 2 million more had fled the country. Many countries were both purposefully involved and uninvolved in a way that was shocking and set some very weird precedents. This tragedy is considered to be the final official leg in the Rwandan Civil War.
A flood of refugees. Every day, thousands upon thousands of people fleeing the war-torn capital of Kigali arrive here in Ruhangu, trying to escape the war. Most of them are malnourished and have lost virtually everything. Yet, they are Rwanda's lucky ones. At least, they're alive.
Did you know that this happened? I didn't learn about it until 2017. It was my senior year of high school, and I took a class on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which I would now consider a class on the Palestinian genocide. My teacher was amazing, and he wanted us to understand the gravity of what was happening in Palestine. And he did this by showing us this other tragedy, this other awful ethnic cleansing. But a majority of people that I've talked to didn't even know this was a thing. None of my friends learned about it in school. I don't know any other classes at my school that even taught this. Any history class or global issues class I've taken so far in my college experience hasn't spoken on this at all. And now, 30 years later, so many people don't even know that this happened. But the people I've talked to that do know that this happened did not learn it in school. They learned it from film. They learned it from movies that have come out in the last 30 years. And that got me thinking, how much legwork do movies do to teach about genocide? Genocide is not a topic that can easily be brought up to middle schoolers in history classes, or let alone high schoolers. Many curriculums purposefully leave out talks of genocide. Even in college, where classes become a lot more niche for history, unless you are pursuing specific educational tracks, I doubt you'll run into information about a lot of genocides, besides the obvious World War II, the Holocaust. And so I started to do a lot of deep diving on the Rwandan genocide in film. Because violence like this does not happen overnight, but it seems to be forgotten overnight or suppressed very quickly. And this was not something that came out of nowhere in the country of Rwanda either. Starting with the Belgian occupation of that area of Africa, tensions between ethnic groups were already extremely high. Rwanda is a small country with an extremely high population. About 85% of the country of Rwanda was Hutu at the time of the genocide. The rest were then mostly Tutsi with a little bit of Twa. Twa are the group indigenous to Rwanda. Most other ethnic groups in Rwanda were tragically misplaced and migrated due to just the awful things that many European countries did to Africa. The colonization, the claiming of land, it messed a lot of things up, obviously, and it sparked a lot of internal conflict. Ethnically motivated violence can be tracked in Rwanda, spiking as early as the 1950s, which is eerily similar to the timeline of what is happening in Palestine, with ethnic violence spiking in Rwanda in the 1950s and the Nakba in 1948. This continued throughout the history of Rwanda, including a military coup coup in 1973, but in 1990 the Rwandan Civil War started due to the Rwandan Patriotic Front. The RPF was majoritively Tutsi refugees who invaded Rwanda in 1990, and this became motivation and encouragement and an excuse for Hutu nationalists to incite violence against ethnic minorities. The president of Rwanda, who was the victim of the plane crash, the president at the time directly accused average Tutsi citizens as being terrorists. Does any of this sound familiar? Now, it's officially unclear which side of the conflict shot down the president's plane. The majority of the sources I have used for this essay, though, do tend to lean towards the idea that Hutu nationalists shot down the plane to further excuse violence against Tutsi civilians. The impact of a situation like this that has gone on for years, that has peaked in such an awful wave of quick and brutal violence, that kind of event leaves an impact on the entire world. It only took 100 days for 800,000 people to be murdered. That level of pain and suffering is unfathomable. That kind of suffering is something that the human brain just can't process. And when we can't speak about it, we create about it. And it seems that these creations also end up being one of our only lines of education and ensuring that our story can be told and lessons can be learned to future generations. When I was taking this class on the Palestinian genocide, we watched a movie on the Rwandan genocide. Even in my class where we were learning about the actual conflict, film was still used as a major teaching tool. It seems that movies are going to be a lot more important than we thought when it comes to preserving history, even fictional movies, which led me to my idea for this essay. Originally, I was going to watch every single movie ever made about the Rwandan genocide. Problem with that is that a majority of movies were not available to me. Some movies never got released in English nor had subtitles. Some movies were also not distributed, and I could not find a copy anywhere online for some of these. So instead, I settled on 3 movies. These 3 movies were all released in America at some point. They are all from radically different directors, from radically different point of views, and came out at different times as well. This will only be fictional movies. There will be no documentaries. I just want to go ahead and clarify that right now. Also, if it's not obvious, I am not Rwandan and I'm coming at this from an outside perspective. I've done my best to educate myself about this topic, but again, there are always places where anyone from the outside, might miss something, might have room to grow and learn. So that's my disclaimer on that. Let's go ahead and jump right into the first movie, which is the first one that comes out chronologically in this order, Hotel Rwanda. Hotel Rwanda is a 2004 docudrama film co-written and directed by Terry George. It stars Don Cheadle, who, God bless his soul, absolutely love him, and Sophie Okonedo. Cheadle plays a hotelier named Paul Rusesabagina, and Okonedo plays his wife Tatiana. The film documents Paul's real-life efforts to save the lives of his family and more than 1,000 other refugees by providing them with shelter in the besieged Hotel des Micolines. Also, if it wasn't clear, this film is based on Paul's real-life experience. It is a fictionalized version of it, though, but it is supposedly based on a true story. Paul, who's the manager of this Belgian hotel, is Hutu, while his wife, Tatiana, is Tutsi. Relationships like this are a huge source of friction for Hutu nationalists, and this includes a side character, George Rutaganda. He is a good supplier to the hotel, who is Hutu, and is heavily involved in the Hutu nationalist movement. At the beginning of the film, he even tries to recruit Paul to this Hutu nationalist militia group. Throughout this movie, we can hear various radio broadcasts that are very accurate to real radio broadcasts that were going on during the time, where there were Hutu nationalist channels and Hutu nationalist hours on public radio that would encourage genocidal violence. These radio transmissions occurred even before the actual genocide. It was very haunting. It kind of reminds me on the tirades that the alt-right will go on nowadays on podcasts. Paul is a man who, while surrounded by political tension, does not seem to take it seriously. He doesn't believe anyone would actually take up arms against anyone. He thinks that this is all just a bunch of racist bullshit that will eventually pass. Even after seeing a Hutu power parade, even after seeing employees and friends fearing for their lives when their papers are being checked, Paul seems still very blind to this issue. His wife wants to leave the country, he wants to stay dedicated to his job at the hotel, and then the genocide starts. This movie is an incredibly hard watch, as it should be. It is not only a hard watch because of the content, which it pulls no punches with the content, it is also a hard watch because Don Cheadle is acting his heart out. The foundation for this screenplay was actually based off of a book. Paul Rozesa-Bagina went out of his way to tell his story to an author, and that author, Philip Gourevitch, turned it into a very hard to read book, not because it's not well written, it's very well written, hard to read content-wise, called We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families. What a title. Paul uses the fact that this hotel is a Belgium-owned hotel, a white-owned hotel, to shield not only his Tutsi wife and mixed children, but also to shield off various other Tutsi families, refugees, American travelers that had been stranded in the country. Everyone's holed up in this hotel, and because it is a white hotel, they're offered a little bit of protection. From a very clinical cinematic perspective, it's an extremely well-made movie. The cinematography is beautiful, the composition of shots and the color work is amazing. It does a very good job balancing the horror of the time mixed with the joy and relief of familial love. This film also took a very concrete position on which ethnic group, which political group shot down the president of Rwanda's plane. This movie just straight up says the Hutus didn't. The movie actually pretty explicitly goes into the idea that the Hutus shot down the plane as an excuse to begin ethnic cleansing. The film just straight up says governments who want to hurt people will make excuses to hurt people. Genocidal regimes will lie to look like they can do whatever they want to do. The hardest part of this movie to watch for sure are the scenes where the governments of these other countries, such as Belgium, such as the United States, etc., they send their military in only to pick up tourists, travelers, missionaries, etc., that are stranded in the country of Rwanda. They do not help anyone else. Children, mothers, families, orphans, it doesn't matter. The other governments offer no help to any native Rwandans.
How can they not intervene when they witness such atrocities?
I think if people see this footage, they'll say, oh my God, that's horrible. And then go on eating their dinners.
There are so many shots of these white tourists and these white people crying and looking extremely guilty as they are safely escorted out by the US government, and it makes you just as angry as it needs to make you. I think it was handled very well in this movie. Since this movie is posed as a true story, or a, telling of a true story, it is a lot more personal and emotional. It follows really just Paul and his family. Any side characters you see and all that are directly connected to Paul. And this means also that Paul is kind of taken out of his role from real-life survivor to kind of like a movie hero sometimes, which I'm not the only one to critique this. Alfred de Hiro wrote a book called Hotel Rwanda, or The Tutsi Genocide as Seen by Hollywood. This book came out in 2008. He did interviews with 74 people who stayed inside the hotel during this period of time where Paul was the hotelier protecting everyone. And this book includes multiple allegations that Paul was not the kind of guy that the movie portrays him as being. Supposedly, Paul extorted money from hotel guests for rooms and food, and he was heavily romanticized in the film. In an article written by Jos van Oygen for African Arguments, the author claims that while Paul was objectively a good person, he was not the hero the movie made him out to be. A lot of people seem to be wanting to take very black and white stances with not only the character of Paul, but the person of Paul. That's not my place to judge, but it is important to note that the film turns him into like a proper hero who is willing to fully sacrifice his life, go out of his way to house and hold children, to sacrifice himself for his wife. There are all these layers to it that make Paul into a very perfect movie hero, and that might not be 100% what happened. But because the movie is some people's entry points into this. That might be what they believe Paul to be as time passes and information spreads. It was nominated for multiple awards, including 3 Oscars: Best Original Screenplay, Best Actor, shout out Don Cheadle, and Best Supporting Actress, shout out to Sophie Okonedo, who played his wife. When I told people that I was doing my essay on the Rwandan genocide, most people, if they were over the age of 25, said, "Oh, like Hotel Rwanda," in response to me. So this movie had a pretty big impact on how people saw this tragedy. Like I said, this movie pulled absolutely no punches with the depictions of the violence. While it was definitely more censored than another movie on this list, when it comes to the actual acts of violence, the aftermath was everywhere. Dead bodies littering the streets, actors sobbing their hearts out. There's this one specific scene where Don Cheadle's character of Paul returns to the hotel after desperately trying to go get some supplies because the hotel is running low on food and necessities. And on his drive back, he notices that the road is extremely bumpy, but it's too foggy for him to see. And so he gets out of the car to make sure he is still on the road, as he might be lost. And he sees that he is on the road, but it's extremely bumpy because the road is no longer a road. It's just one giant mass grave. And Paul returns to the hotel and has a sobbing, crying breakdown. And when he's done with his breakdown, he cleans himself up, straightens his tie, and gets right back to work being a hotel manager to protect the people inside of it. If this is to be people's only knowledge of the Rwandan genocide, I think that this film does justice with what it can be. You know, it does the best it can be. It's obviously not educational, it's emotionally driven, you know what I mean? But it gets the job done, and I think that it hits people really where they need it to when it comes to caring about issues that don't affect them. It gets them in the right place of empathy. Sometimes you need a cartoonishly hero character to resonate. Sometimes you have to do that. I do think in the inclusion of characters such as Colonel Oliver were really just to appeal to the white audience, and I cannot blame them for doing that because it's an American-made movie, and here in America, we just don't seem to care about people who don't look like us. So having a mythical, amazing white general who's a total amazing good guy who can critique the system with a strong voice, like a father figure. Maybe that's just what was needed. The second movie we're going to be talking about is called Sometimes in April. Sometimes in April has a special place in my heart because of the fact that this was the movie my teacher showed me in my Palestinian genocide class. To go ahead and get the clinical film part of this out of the way, Raoul Peck is the director and writer of this film. Previous to this, he exclusively did documentaries, and you can tell, in my opinion, this is not a well-made movie. Structurally, edit-wise, it's told non-linearly, and I usually like stories that are non-linear, but I think it did a little bit of a disservice to this in particular, just based on the fact that you can tell this is kind of the director's first narrative beast in a fictional sense, and you know, it's it's his first non-documentary, and you can tell, you know what I mean? He mostly tackles political and societal issues that involve the Black community. He's Haitian himself, and I think that passion to make this movie kind of fixes all my other critiques with it. He wants to tell this story, and he tells it in the way he felt like he needed to tell it, and even though, like, skill-wise maybe it's not 100%, it makes up for it in how brutal and painful and raw and honest this film is. The movie has 2 different timelines, so we have the actual genocide in 1994, and then we have the aftermath 10 years later. This film was released in February 2005, so it was a little overshadowed by Hotel Rwanda, but it stars Idris Elba and has a pretty, 5-star cast. So I'm shocked more people haven't heard of this one as compared to Hotel Rwanda, strictly for Idris Elba, if nothing else. Don't get me wrong, I love Don Cheadle, but Idris Elba, come on. What's interesting is that this story follows another Hutu man. Idris Elba plays Augustine Muganza. He survived the genocide, bared witness to a lot of violence, and his brother, in 2004, is standing trial for his involvement in the genocide. So the plot cuts between 1994, where Augustine is living through the tragedy, and then 2004, where he's reliving the tragedy by attending these international trials for the war criminals that were apprehended at the end of the genocide. He's not the only one returning. We hear multiple different survivors' stories, fictional stories, obviously, but there is no doubt that they were very obviously based on real instances of horrific violence. These stories are hard to watch. It is hard to listen to. I'm kind of shocked that this was allowed to be shown to a bunch of high schoolers. I am glad that it was. This needs to be seen. But wow, rewatching it for this specific assignment, it left me in tears. I cried basically the whole movie through. The weakest part of this movie, in my opinion, are the consistent cuts to the American government. Prudence Bushnell was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the State of African American Affairs under President Bill Clinton, and we cut to her a lot in the film and her failed attempts to get the US government to intervene with the genocide. I have not been able to find much information about whether or not any of that is accurate, like if any of this was real conversations, etc. This movie, though, does go into detail about the events that led up to the genocide, including the Belgian occupation of the area. If you have never heard of the Rwandan genocide, this movie will give you the most education and hard facts about it as compared to Hotel Rwanda. Again, this is where I think director Raoul Peck, his documentary history plays into this. As you can tell, this is an educational movie first and a story second, which is why it is weak as a film, but very good for a film about a historical event. This movie also, similar to a documentary style, as time passes in the movie and we continue to cut back to 1994, a regular death count with the date is maintained every flashback, which is really brutal to see. Much like in the previous movie, our main character of Augustine here is married to a Tutsi woman and therefore has mixed children. During this genocide, any children that had any Tutsi blood were considered tainted. This movie also shows very bluntly that Augustine was threatened a lot for being a Tutsi sympathizer. Tragically, Augustine is unable to protect his family in this movie, though, contrary to Hotel Rwanda. The hardest scene in this movie is a scene in an all-girls school where a teacher is trying to protect her students and fails, and we very bluntly and graphically see a room full of middle grade children being shot down. Hotel Rwanda did a really good job showing the aftermath, but Sometimes in April just shows you what happens. There are graphic scenes with guns, with machetes. It is really hard to watch, but I think that's necessary because this is what happened. Bearing witness to this tragedy is essential. The most heartfelt and moving part of the movie, though, was a scene where during the 2004 trials, Augustine is not the only one invited. He's invited to speak at his brother's trial or to observe his brother's trial, but he's obviously not the only one. A lot of other people are coming to speak on their experiences with these various war criminals. And there is a scene where this one woman, who is anonymous to Augustine at the time, they speak through a hotel wall to each other. And she invites him to come to her trial. And he will not see her face. This is an anonymously done trial for a rape survivor. And she just doesn't want to go alone, so she asks this completely anonymous stranger, this person she's never met before, to just bear witness to her story. And it hurts. Like, this movie just fucking hurts. There are so many times in this movie where I just wanted to, cover my eyes. It's just a hard watch. You see bodies layered over bodies in various states of extremely realistic decay. There's so much blood. It's as close to real footage as we're probably ever gonna get. You know what I mean? It is as close to a documentary, you know what I mean, as we can get. Whew, let's rein it in and let's talk about the more clinical film stuff with this. So this is the second movie told from one of the good ones narrative perspective with a Hutu husband who has married a Tutsi woman and had children with her. This is also the second time that we have a movie where a husband from an oppressive class is warned multiple times over by his Tutsi wife that bad things are happening and they need to leave, and he refuses her, and they stay, and terrible things happen. This time, though, his wife and children do not survive, as compared to Hotel Rwanda, where everyone survives. The flashes to the American government are not well done, and they act more as like a fact-spilling mouthpiece. Very similar to Colonel Oliver in the previous one, where it acts as like the director's voice. It's also interesting because they cut to real-life speeches made by government officials such as Bill Clinton about the issue. Probably one of the most interesting aspects of this movie, though, when it comes to inserting real-life footage of things and real-life clips of things, is not the government speeches as much as it is putting the Rwandan genocide in our Americanized timeline. During the 100 Days of the Rwandan Genocide, Kurt Cobain kills himself, and Tonya Harding's case goes to trial. These little bits and pieces we see of American pop culture lifestyle counteracted with the tragedy in Rwanda helps us put it in a perspective of like times we did live through. When you put a tragic event like that in a timeline, in a definite space, and you force the person to acknowledge that they remember that space, it helps make it more visceral, more real, more tangible. The problem with a lot of tragedies like this that quite literally happen on the other side of the ocean is we can't feel close to the people, which is why I felt Hotel Rwanda did a really good job having us connect with the character of Paul. And then this movie does a really good job connecting you to time and space and the world and making it very real. Sometimes in April is less of a story and more of an experience. You are experiencing pain alongside these characters. Meanwhile, Hotel Rwanda is a lot more of a story. You are seeing the story of Paul. The final movie I will not be going into as much detail as the other two, strictly because it is my least favorite, and I want to talk about more of a phenomenon that this movie exudes rather than the execution of the movie itself, because the execution of the movie is what I fear a lot of movies about various world tragedies and genocides will turn into. The final movie is called Shooting Dogs or Beyond the Gates, depending on what country you were in when it was released. First off, before we get into the serious parts of this, Hugh Dancy is in this? Will Graham, why are you here? This is another movie that came out in 2005. It's very interesting that it's like the world decided that 10 years after the tragedy, you could finally start to monetize it. This movie is directed by Michael Kenton Jones, and while it was like released on September 11th, 2005 to the Toronto Film Festival, it wasn't officially released in the UK and then therefore internationally into 2006. If I'm not mistaken, this actually had a higher budget than the other two, but it feels so much cheaper, and I think it's because of the execution. This movie follows the perspective of white teachers, white priests, white missionaries, white people who are in Rwanda at the time of the genocide. It is one of those movies. It is based, though, on the true experiences of a BBC News producer who was there at the time. So you walk this very fine line of you are telling someone's true experiences, but you also are speaking on a tragedy from an outside perspective. At the same time, the news producer who this is based off of, David Belton, is also a co-producer and I believe a co-writer on this film. And unlike Hotel Rwanda, which was not filmed in Rwanda, this movie was. It was filmed on location in specific places where this BBC News producer was trapped during the genocide. It follows an English teacher at a school. The school and the church that oversees the school is run by a Belgium, not military, like just Belgian soldiers run the place. There's like a little romance, there's like a little side stuff, and then the genocide happens. This movie focuses a lot on people wanting to get information out in the world and trying to figure out very much like why this is happening, why no one is stopping it. It has a big spirit of why. And the other two movies haven't had really a spirit of why. They've had more of a spirit of like, how could this happen? How can you survive it? How do you live? Knowing what happened, how do you move on? How do you live in the moment? How do you protect who you love? Meanwhile, this movie is a lot more big Hollywood with it. And I keep saying American, but this movie was produced by people in the United Kingdom. It was released in the United Kingdom, all British actors. Like, it is a British movie, but I'm kind of lumping it in because of the Americanized movie view. The Americanized movie view puts the world into two categories. Main characters who are Western and who are white, English speaking, or you're just not. Like, those are the two categories that a lot of American films basically have. You are this or you are that. And this movie is a very this movie, not a that movie. It was my least favorite because of this. It felt the least authentic. It felt the least fair. There is some very visceral imagery in this, and I do not feel like it censored anything. I just feel like it wasn't focusing on the right stuff. It did speak very heavily, though, on the why. Why is no one stopping this? Why isn't Belgium stopping this? Why hasn't America stepped in? Why is no one stepping in? And I think those are important conversations to have. I really do. But this movie was just like very glaringly pale, and I felt like we were focusing on the wrong people during it. I don't know how to describe it. Watching this after Sometimes in April did this movie a heavy disservice. If I had seen this first, I do not think I would be judging it as harshly, but because I watched Hotel Rwanda and then Sometimes in April hit me like a truck. Because I watched that before this movie is getting the short end of my stick. This movie was the least educational and the least visceral and the least real. It is narrative based, but it's based on a narrative that doesn't feel like it actually connects to the tragedy. It feels like its own self-contained story within a tragedy. Like, you know how Titanic is like Jack and Rose's story inside the Titanic? That's just kind of how this felt. This is their story inside the genocide, while the other two felt like this story of the genocide. And because of that, it was the least good when it comes to actually talking about the genocide. And in a world where we have such limited resources, apparently, for people to learn about events that are just outside their realms, it worries me when we go out of our way to tell stories about other groups of people using people who are not in those groups. I don't think this movie shouldn't have been made. I don't advocate for censorship like that or censorship like anything, but I do believe that this movie, it could have had more. It could have done more. It was very focused on the story it was telling that felt, again, a story within a thing. It wasn't a story about the thing, but it kept saying it was a story about the thing, but it was a story within the thing, and I did not appreciate it. I think married with Hotel Rwanda and Sometimes in April, I think it has its merits. Like I said, it addressed a lot of more of the international weight of what was going on in a way that was a little bit more digestible than the other two movies have. But out of the three films, it's definitely the weakest. And it is the movie I want to see the least moving forward. It is the movie I want to see replicated the least in the future when looking at other movies about various other international tragedies, ethnic cleansings, and genocides. In my opinion, genocide is a topic that is about the people. Genocide is such a personal crime. It is about identity. And to strip that identity away from the movie by focusing on an outsider's perspective, like in Shooting Dogs, where you're just focusing on British missionaries and teachers instead of the Rwandan people, I feel like that does a disservice. It's not fair. Like, fair is the only word that keeps going into my mind. It is not a fair portrayal. I have a very specific rubric I'm supposed to do when it comes to the conclusion of this, so if it sounds a little odd, that's why. I still wanted to post this publicly, even if it's an assignment, because I feel like this conversation is worth having due to recent events. It's very easy for all of us to turn blind eyes to things that happen in other parts of the world, to things that happened before we were born, to things that don't affect us. It is so easy to live as a little bubble, and it's so easy to just let other people die, and to let other people be forgotten, and to let other people suffer. But film is a wonderful way to keep memories alive. I'm a big fan of books, I love books, I'm a big fan of all other mediums, but film mixes the visual with the auditory in such a way. We immerse ourselves with these people, we immerse ourselves in these forgotten stories. We learn and feel what people have gone through throughout history, their love, their pain, their sacrifice, their fear, their perseverance. It can be so well translated into this wonderful, magical thing. But it's all based on who's making it, right? It's all based on perspective. It's all based on who's funding it, who's writing it, whatever. But it's interesting. that when I try to talk to people in the real world about this real tragedy, they only know how to reference a fictional movie. And I think that says so much for the power that movies have when it comes to history and education, especially about topics like this, topics we don't talk about, topics that are too hard to talk about. When humans cannot speak, they create. So where do I think we should go from here? I think more Rwandan movies about the Rwandan genocide should be distributed out of Africa. And I think we should invest more time and money into getting studios to distribute films about lived experiences from the people who lived it. I'm willing to bet money there are hundreds of filmmakers in Rwanda who want to tell their stories. Let's let them. And that goes for any group suffering under any form of genocidal oppression. We should go out of our way to give them money to tell their stories. In the same breath, we should also embrace the power of fiction, embrace the power of storytelling. It's fascinating to me that the one movie that was not based on a real individual person, the character of Augustine in Sometimes in April, is not based on a real man, unlike, Paul in Hotel Rwanda, or the BBC guy whose name I have forgotten in Shooting Dogs. Augustine's narrative, his fictional story, moves me so deeply. So I think it's important to go out of our way to embrace the power of the fictionalized while supporting also real voices, own voices, narratives about situations like this. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think people want to hear stories about this. Like I said, maybe it's hard to watch, maybe it's really hard to look at, maybe you want to turn away, maybe you cry the whole movie. Humans naturally carry such a high level of empathy. We want to bear witness to each other. We want to remember each other. We want to love each other. We really do. And I think movies like this, about tragedies like this, if they were just given more support, they could be used as even better educational tools. Do I think all fiction is educational tools? No, not at all. I think fiction deserves to exist as fiction. I think fiction deserves to exist as an unreal experience, as a hyper-real experience. But I think fiction about genocide might be our only line of defense against people who want to erase stories like this. And I think it's important that stories like this are told with authenticity and reverence. This was a significantly more serious video than I typically do. I don't know if I will be returning to a serious topic like this again. But if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I've linked my main bibliography. I've linked my research links in the description, so that if you want to do more research on the Rwandan genocide, feel free to do so in the description. I've left my actual historical bibliography links down there. I have also linked a few resources so that we can all together support Palestine, because it's very important to make sure history does not repeat itself. Okay, thank you.